I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Fred Cummins here today from the UCD School of Computer Science. And just to give you a brief biography for Fred, he's a PhD in Cognitive Science and Linguistics from Indiana on speech rhythm. He joined UCD in 1999 and is currently co-directing the Cognitive Science program since 2001. And his interests include research on joint speech, subjects and subjectivities, rhythm as the glue that holds things together, and speech and the voice. So thanks very much for presenting today.
Thank you. Thanks very much for coming out. It's exam week. I know it's a severe absence of students, but it's totally understandable. I'm surprised people are here. It's delighted. It's really nice to have the opportunity to present this work in the School of Psychology, because it's kind of homeless work. So I'm always delighted to have the opportunity to speak about it. I study something which is familiar to everybody, and when we have an instance of it, we know what we're looking at, which is good, which is multiple people saying the same thing at the same time. It's just a peculiar sort of thing. But in order to illustrate why I think it merits our attention, and why it raises issues that are of importance for a variety of disciplines, I got to frame my observations a little bit with what we think about language, what we think language is. Here's a little bit from Planet of the Apes, and one of the apes is an expert in animal psychology, and he has a pet human, and he's taught the human sign language, and this seems to be heresy, so they're very worried about the implications of teaching the ape sign language, and they're arguing about whether this would be good for apes or good for humans, or it rattles the status quo. So clearly these apes care an awful lot about their presumably God-given power of language, and see some danger in introducing it to humans. And if you go look at how we teach students in linguistics, students in psychology about what language is, you find this kind of view of language as language is, first of all, for communication. One could query that. I mean, the role of language in thought opens up a whole other world. But there seems to be almost unanimity when we're dealing with language, we're dealing with a rule-based system of symbolic communication with a bunch of discrete units which admit of combinatorial sequencing. You're very familiar with this, I don't have to sell it to you. I just put it here just to show that there's a great deal of agreement that this is what language is. If we're going to talk about language, we're talking about a relatively abstract, symbolic communication system in which messages are encoded in sequences of symbols. And we care greatly about that. Like the apes there, we care because we actually use this to distance ourselves from them damn dirty apes. We like to say that, well, language plays a huge role in the fate of our species, and we went from being just another primate species to being a threat to the planet itself, and somewhere in that spread from Africa to our current state, language played an awfully big role. It seems that language provides a scaffolding with which we build human societies, with which we free ourselves from an appetite of engagement with the present and can time travel backwards and forwards. It seems to be the basis for thought and thinking, so somehow language has come to be at the very heart of what it is that we consider to be human. And in the scientific study of language, just to emphasize its importance, there's this sort of nesting of disciplines, and these are, again, just graphics grabbed from a variety of Linguistics 101 courses, but you can see that graphically even they subscribe to a certain orthodoxy. There's I usually present this as a stack to my students, but the stack goes from phonetics, which is the messy business of speaking with tongues and spit and such, through phonology, which is much more symbolic, morphology, syntax at the very beating heart of language. This is where most of the attention in the 20th century has gone. The syntax, semantics, and then we sort of emerge back out into the real world of human intentions and human actions with pragmatics. And that is taken as an appropriate way of structuring the study of language. Underlying all this, whether we're doing phonology, morphology, syntax, or formal semantics, we have this idea of a symbolic code which is necessary in order to encode ideas. And inherent in all this, lurking in all this is the sort of assumption that the modality in which linguistic communication or languaging is going on doesn't really matter very much. We know that we can type, we can write messages, we can. Literacy has changed us hugely, but we're very familiar with written language. We can speak, obviously, we can even sing, we can rap, and it's been a big political battle to get sign languages recognized as full languages, which they are. So we seem to be chasing something which is relatively independent of the modality. I'm not happy with this picture I've just outlined at all. I am very, very unhappy with this picture that I've just outlined at all. It seems to me to be beholden to a view of reality that is untenable. First of all, it suggests that what language is, whatever it was that happens to the human species to differentiate us from those damn dirty apes, has to do with the exchange of messages in a symbolic code from one mind to another mind. Now, I'm always very careful about the use of the word mind because it awakes different associations in different groups. I have in question here the notion of a closed, private domain of experience rooted in a Cartesian and Kantian idea of what a subject is. This is a domain that you have access to yours and I have access to mine, but I don't have access to yours and you don't have access to mine. And language here is viewed as the passing of messages from one such hermetically sealed domain to the other. Everyone knows there's problems with this. Nobody likes solipsism as a position. But this is the way we talk about it, and this turns the business of language communication into something like this. We have the codes of language, these sequences of symbols, are doing a job of passing secret encoded messages from one domain, typically viewed of as brain-bound, to another domain. I think this is a weird view of human communication. My own home discipline is phonetics, and this makes itself felt very much in phonetics when we get subjects into this seventh circle of hell called the anechoic chamber, and we record them here as if this was the way to collect the pristine phonetic data that can inform our study of language. We record their sounds in an artificial environment in which all reverberation is gone. It's horrible being in an anechoic chamber. If you've ever been in one, when you speak, your voice dies. It's quite the opposite. You know how the resonance of a shower induces you to sing? Well, an anechoic chamber would really make you want to shut up. This is an odd view of communication. It turns communication into a private business. So it's the encoding of ideas into the sound that the phonetician can then go in and mine. But when I look at vocal communication, I see this kind of thing. I see people who are engaged with each other, who are present to each other, who are co-present for each other, who are very much involved in each other's business reciprocally and with their whole bodies. And I don't see anything private and secret going on, but I see something that is both public and collective. And so I want to object to whom, I'm not sure, Mr. Chomsky perhaps, that linguistics has got it wrong from the start, that language, if we want to understand what important thing happens to the human species as opposed to those ape species, an amodal, symbolic form of message passing is not the right place to start. The voice is the right place to start. And the act of speaking, uttering, and co-speaking, uttering together. Now, in 20th century linguistics, you can divide that up into two big periods. The first half, structural linguistics, was poster boy Ferdinand de Saussure, who valorized something called langue, which was the systemic organization of individual elements. And he kind of regarded parole as a messy, necessary business. That's the kind of confused business of speaking in which errors and spit intrude. The second half saw a different agenda with Chomsky and generative grammar, but Chomsky, again, insisted he was studying an abstract underlying competence to the extent that he disregarded performance almost. He regarded what people do as being of secondary importance. I, as an empiricist, greatly object to this disregard for human data. if I want to study something, I go and first of all look at it. So what's been dismissed here, the parole, the performance, is what people are actually doing. And what people are doing when they speak is something that's continuous with our common ancestors with the great apes. The voice has been around since we had the last common ancestor about 5 or 6 million years ago. Writing, I'll remind you, is about 5,000 years old. And widespread literacy is about 500 years old. So if we were to look at we stretch this out in time, there's the last common ancestor of the chimpanzees, bonobos, and humans. There we are in 2015, coming up to Christmas. About 5 or 6 million years in there. This graph is too crude. You can't even show writing, let alone widespread literacy, on this graph. So anything that insists that it is amodal is of very recent provenance completely. It's if you think the voice is incidental to the business of language, then you've got a hell of a job reconnecting with this biological past. That's why I'm fascinated by the voice and by what it is to speak. And this fascination has really become amplified through studying joint speech, or those occasions when people say the same thing at the same time. Because joint speech is something, we have a blind spot with respect to it. There is no scientific study of joint speech. I've had to invent the term, bringing a few different kinds of vocal behavior together. So choral speaking is the performance that children do at the school when they all stand up and recite "Piggy saw a pear dropping through the air" to the delight of their parents, for example. Chanting is a beautifully ambiguous word in English. It extends from the shouts of the protesters to the solemnity of the monks of Glenstall Abbey. Gregorian chant, it's indifferent to whether it's spoken or sung. It's a very useful word in its ambiguity. I came to this whole business by studying people moving, the business of synchronizing the organs of speech, the tongues, the jaws, which is a serious movement problem, so I invented a laboratory task called synchronous speech. I'll show you. There's not really an awful lot of science of prayer, because typically the question the scientists ask of prayer is, does it work? And that's not really what I'm asking here. What I'm asking is, what are people doing? So I'm going to use the term joint speech as an umbrella term to bring all these together. And it's not reified, it's not terribly theory bound, because no matter where we're coming from theoretically, we can at least agree when we're looking at a bunch of people who are saying the same thing at the same time. When you start with that empirical forceps, then you can use that to pick out different domains of human activity. Rather than running off to the lab and doing experiments, we can say, well, if we go out there and just look at human behavior around the planet, where do people say the same thing at the same time? And it serves to pick out discrete, highly interesting, emotionally charged domains of human activity, the first of which is prayer. So I don't go to this because I have an interest in prayer. I find prayer because I have an interest in speaking together. And it doesn't lead me to one tradition or another. We find the business of speaking together in every major religious tradition, integrated into rituals which are very venerable, many of them older than we know, than we have a historical record for. It seems that the integration of joint speech and the associated gestures into rituals is a lot older than writing. We have no idea how old, but certainly it's part of what we would consider the very birth of a symbolic society in which living together is founded upon a common order. But I'm guessing. What I can do is look around today and see that no matter which religious tradition we're talking about, people are doing this, they're speaking at the same time, saying the same thing. In each case, there are some remarkable things you notice. Well, for one thing, the role of speaker and listener is obliterated in this distinction. That already forces us to come at this business of speaking together in a slightly different fashion. We can't, the business of passing messages doesn't really apply. You can frame it as everyone's talking as an individual channel to the big guy upstairs. That doesn't really work for traditions that don't have a God but still have joint speaking. But I'm not a theist, and I don't acknowledge anybody at the other end. I'm looking at human behavior, and in this behavior, people are doing it all together saying the same thing at the same time, and they're hearing and the text is known. So the message passing view of what this kind of languaging is just not going to work for me. There are certain characteristics to this kind of vocal behavior. So you can see I'm taking sort of an ethological approach. I'm coming at it as if I was from Mars and saying, well, what's going on here? And one of the first things I spot is an awful lot of repetition. The rosary is repeated again and again and again and again. You find that repetition, you find it in Islam, you find it in Buddhism, you find it in Hinduism, you find it in all these major faiths, very often together with beads for keeping tally and so on. So it doesn't really matter which tradition you're in, you're going to get this repetition. We have to ask what that's about. You find a stability of form. There are certain highly stylized prosodic patterns that are quite distinct from the kind of form we use when we're speaking. I'll play you an example later on of a woman reciting the Hail Mary. And it doesn't sound, these are not prosodic patterns, musical patterns you find in spontaneous speech, conversational speech. So there's a lot of interesting things going on here. Another thing we might note is through the integration into rituals, we very often find patterns of call and response. So there are divided roles. There's an imam or a priest, or sometimes a group of worshippers who say one thing, and then there's a generalized response. A very specific form of this, found in each of these traditions, is a generalized assent, which we know as the Amen. And it comes up as literally that word, Amen, 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 in Islam, in Judaism, in Christianity, and in some form in all the traditions. That's a structural characteristic, this call and response business, and it allows us to identify certain structural forms independent of their content. So how complex was the call? How complex was the response? Did the call mirror the response? Is it the same response to multiple calls? These are structural features. We don't have to buy into any religious story in order to recognize them. So it's interesting what happens when we use this empirical observable of people saying the same thing at the same time, and we use it to pick out the domain of prayer. The next domain that's picked out by this strategy is protest. And I love the idea that studying prayer takes you to studying protest. I think that this means that they have something very important in common, and I would like to understand what it is that they have in common. In protest, we find repetition. We find stability of form. We find call of response. We find this redundancy, this over-practice nature. We find all this in protest, and we also find this urgency, this need to participate. The fact that taking part or not taking part really matters. In Ireland, which is a country full of lapsed Catholics who only go to Mass for weddings and funerals, most such tourists in the church hate joining in the creed. They don't mind going through the associated gestures, the kneeling and the standing and so on, but to speak is to be committed to what you're speaking. That's why there's a creed. That's why there's an overt expression of faith, and why the actual form of the overt expression of faith is so contested within each religious tradition. If you follow the origin of the various creeds, the Nicene Creed, the Apostolic Creed, and the various expressions of faith in other traditions, you find that's where people argue, because it really matters what the words are at that point where there's an overt statement of what it is that we're here about. How similar that is to going on a protest. I hate going on a protest. I hate joining in those chants because they can turn nasty at any time. Very often I share maybe an issue with the protesters, but I don't share necessarily a worldview. And I remember feeling very uncomfortable attending, because I go to protests out of professional interest now, attending protests outside the Doyle and seeing the chant go from complaints about the health service to misogynistic attacks on Mary Harney at the time, for example, and suddenly realising that if you're chanting, you're being sucked along into this wake of emotional content you don't necessarily subscribe to. So there's something interesting going on here, linking prayer and protest. And the same strategy, we can ask, what else does it pick out? It picks out sports. And it doesn't pick out all sports, it picks out specific sports. Rugby doesn't have a chanting tradition, and soccer does have a chanting tradition. Rugby has a singing tradition, which is different. Some other sports have chanting traditions, so they're quite good over in America, and baseball and ice hockey and so on. But the richest tradition, I think, is in soccer. And obviously soccer is nothing like the Roman Catholic liturgy or a protest. But we find certain structural characteristics again. We find the repetition. We find the origination of these quasi-musical forms which are stable and passed around and varied only slightly and move as cultural objects in their own right. I forgot to mention, in common again to the prayer and the protest, is the erasure of division between speech and music, something which is considered absolutely dichotomous in received traditions. Music is one thing and speech is another thing. Here there is no clear division. The word chant points to that, but when we repeat things, they acquire a stylized musical prosody. The musical elements of the voice, the melody, the rhythm, often accentuated with gestures or with fist pumping. These musical elements all come to the fore, and they do so in this domain as well. So here we have something interesting. We've got, in each case, we have people coming together with common purpose. So we have this weird notion of a shared subjective pole, a shared subjectivity, which is, I find the word useful, enacted and maintained in real time. That is, it's brought into being by doing. So the only way to do whatever it is that's been done here is to take part and actually do the speech. So joint speech is at the centre of extremely valued practices and rituals in every human culture. It's accorded the highest significance by practitioners, and it provides us some means of enacting a collective identity, expressing common purpose, expressing a common view on things, a common perspective on the world. Which, if we now think of that as a language behaviour that is a lot older than writing, that suddenly becomes kind of interesting. And even more so when we recognise that we have no science that can deal with this. And why do we have no science that can deal with this? Maybe there's no science to be done because it's just a bunch of people, each of whom is just doing something we study perfectly well. If you do a search of the literature, if you go through PubMed, Google Scholar, all those kind of things, and you use, it's difficult to know what term to search for. Choral speech is one, unison speech, synchronous speech, joint speaking. You combine all those terms and you look how many scholarly publications in the scientific domain are there in the area. You find it in the humanities, in ethnomusicology, but how many do you find in the scientific domain? The answer is something short of 900. That's tiny. If we take the marginal phenomena of speaking in tongues, a vocal practice which is restricted to members of very specific religions exhibiting a very deviant behaviour at very particular times, we find 10 times the amount of scholarly work on this phenomenon as we do on joint speaking. There's about 9,000 papers on glossolalia. I suspect half of those are going, is it ancient Aramaic? We can test, record, go back to the lab. Nope, it's not ancient Aramaic. I joke. There are interesting questions to be asked. It's a very interesting phenomenon. I don't want to knock it, but I want to point out that the instances of joint speaking outnumber instances of glossolalia, not by hundreds to one, but by billions to one. And yet we've no science in the area. So I want to show you that you can do science in the area, that there's an object to study, that scientific methods apply, that they are of importance, but that they challenge us as well. And it's not accidental that there's no science in the area. So we've noted this common aspects of repetition, redundancy, integration into rituals, the musical elements of the voice, the performativity, the urgency, the call and response, and the absence of speaker-listener roles, and the absence of a speech-music divide. All those give us a rich field, so where do we even start? Well, here's a recording of the grandmother of one of my former students reciting the rosary. Now, she's on her own, but this is normally done in groups, as you know. It's a practice I hope to make archival recordings of soon. But if you just listen to it, it's kind of nice to listen to.
Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
Can you hear that okay? Now that last line was kind of indistinct. Blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus. You know the words, it's blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. But I'm going to play it to you again.
Blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
I'm going to play the next iteration.
Blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
And the next.
Blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
And the next.
Blessed fruit of thy womb, Jesus.
They are absolutely invariant. There's a stability here which is, as a phonetician, to find this kind of stability is extremely rare. I don't know how you can even do it. And of course the repetition helps. You do this again and again and again and it becomes fossilized. So that kind of stability is of immediate interest when we're dealing with the modality, the voice, which is extremely plastic, highly variable, responsive to all kinds of contexts. When you find invariance in vocal production, there's something really odd going on. We see something similar in the protest domain, just to illustrate almost the same phenomenon. In 1970, Salvador Allende ran for president of Chile in a democratic election and he was elected. His campaign used the slogan, "The people united will never be defeated," or "El pueblo unido jamás será vencido," "The people united will never be defeated." That, he was overthrown in a 1973 CIA-led coup, and that led to this being immortalized as a folk song, and so it became a template for protests around the world. Here are some Irish students protesting about their education cuts, unaware of the link to 1970s Chile. Then I was in Sao Paulo a few years ago where there was a lot of riots going on during the summer. I had the good luck to attend one, and I came across these protesters. If anyone speaks Portuguese, cover your ears, it's very rude. And the tragically misnamed Arab Spring has at its heart this chant. The people demand the fall of the regime, which has been repeated with variations all the way from Tunisia through Algeria and Egypt and the whole of the Middle East. And this has become the template, found as far as South Sudan. So there's a continuity, there's a stability of form here again. These get passed around, the words get changed, but the prosodic template remains the same. So when something is stable, a stable object, we can look at it. And I am a scientist, so I don't mind taking things into the lab. I started in the lab. It was only actually by going out of the lab that I found that this is a really interesting topic. In the lab, this looks like this. You take in two people and you give them a text they haven't seen before, and you say, "Please read this in synchrony. 3, 2, 1.
There is, according to legend, a holy pot of gold at one end. People look, but no one ever finds it. When a man looks for something beyond his reach, his friends say he's looking for the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow."
Bam, they nailed it. But everyone's that good. This is weird. You don't even need any practice. You don't even get better with practice. I've taken people in and given them hours of practice, and they're no better at the end than they were at the start, because they were brilliant at the start. If you're very familiar with each other, these are husband and wife, you do get a bit better. So they're my favorite example because they sound so precise. But again, I emphasize, as a phonetician, we're used to the voice being plastic. We're used to variability being the bane of our existence. Finding anything stable in the voice is very, very hard. This is a very highly coordinated form of music. It's done invisibly behind the lips. There's no tactus or beat involved, and yet with no more instruction than "please synchronize," people bring their movements into lockstep. Yeah.
I'm just curious what kind of punctuation was in the paragraph. Were there commas that people were pausing?
These are normal written texts. They contain commas, and they use the commas.
Yeah. So they're using those as kind of markers.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. There's a kind of speech error that we find under these conditions that we never find in the wild. Now, this is, of course, a very artificial situation. I've asked people to synchronize, and they're trying to stay in synchrony. That's not strictly comparable to what goes on when people say the rosary. If one person makes a mistake in the rosary, the others just carry on. But in this very particular situation where people are trying to synchronize, it's almost like they're tied together. Because if one person makes a mistake, you sometimes find that two people stop speaking abruptly in synchrony at the same time. I'll show you, I can illustrate this best with an analog from the world of running. Now, running is something that we can all do just fine on our own. And if we're constrained to run together, we get a three-legged race. You actually physically tie people together, and they can do it, but it's kind of clunky. And that happens regularly. No one's ever surprised when people fall over in a three-legged race. You can run up to a point, but you're vulnerable in a way that you're not when you're running on your own. Well, the same thing is found when people speak together. So if you listen to this,
big dinosaurs and bigger dinosaurs in battle. Big dinosaurs and bigger dinosaurs in battle. Big dinosaurs and bigger dinosaurs in battle. Big dinosaurs and bigger dinosaurs.
There's one thing, and then it falls apart into two things. And I've dozens of these examples. Here's another one.
Shady, final, pattern, folly, bingo.
Oh,
both at the same time, at the start of a syllable. This is not something you ever find when people speak on their own. So it seems that when people are paying attention to each other, when they're doing their best to stay in synchrony, they become entangled in a way that you can't, that makes them non-independent of each other. The actions of one are not independent of the actions of another. That is interesting.
Do you think somebody leads in the case of prayer? Like, for example...
Leading is a word that needs unpacking there. Temporally, no. Definitely no. You can't, because you get something like delayed auditory feedback. You can't stay 150 milliseconds behind someone. Does someone assert themselves over the other person? Absolutely. In terms of volume, I can establish the volume or the rate or something like that. Yeah. So it doesn't equalize human relations, but the temporal relationship has to be around the zero lag.
Yeah, I guess an imposed lead.
Yeah, you do get that very, very, very much. So this came to the attention of Sophie Scott over in London, who's done a lot of neuroscience of speech and laughter. She's particularly well known for work on laughter. And her student Kyle Jasmine has just got his PhD last week. And this was Kyle's PhD work, where they developed a means for looking at this in an fMRI scanner. Now this is difficult to do. You can only usually get one person at a time inside a scanner unless you're... You're not allowed to move in a scanner, so how the hell do you do this? Well, they developed quite a good protocol where the subject is in the scanner, and I'm sure you're familiar with fMRI methodology. What you're measuring is the increases in regional blood flow in one condition relative to another, subsequent to some presumed increase in neural activity. And there's a lag there, because you do something and it takes about 5 seconds for the regional blood flow to alter. So it takes about 5 seconds to say a phrase. So what we do is we get the subject to read a phrase in various conditions, and then they stay still, and we scan immediately afterwards. And we do it again and again. We can set up a microphone connection with the experimenter outside, and so they had a variety of conditions. We started at the bottom. There was a condition where the subject did nothing, a condition where the subject spoke on their own, because we need to have speaking and listening in here as separate conditions, so one where they hear the experimenter. We need to have a condition where they're speaking and listening, but they're not synchronized, so we have a condition where the subject speaks one sentence and the experimenter speaks another sentence. And we have two conditions where they're synchronizing, in one case with the experimenter, live, bidirectionally coupled, and in one case with the recording of the experimenter, which of course is inflexible, so they're synchronizing with the recording, but it doesn't have that plasticity. We never told subjects there were recordings involved. They were not aware that there were recordings involved. We debriefed them afterwards. None of them knew there were recordings involved, and we did a behavioural experiment afterwards in pristine conditions to see, under far more optimal circumstances, if we're careful with the signal processing, is there something in the voice that will tell you that it's live rather than recorded? And the answer is no. We still had people a chance. So they didn't know that the difference between those two conditions. I'm not much of a one for reading the brains. It's a bit like reading the entrails. I don't know a lot. They're difficult. We can agree on that much. Brains are difficult. But there is something interesting going on here. And the first thing to look at is this conjunction of the live synchrony condition over the combination of speaking and listening. So in speaking together, we are both speakers and listeners. Maybe that's all there is to it. And the answer is no. There's a clear contrast between the live synchrony condition and the conjunction of speaking and listening. So it's not just a conjunction. Those of you who like reading the blobs will spot that what we have here is the auditory cortex on both sides, right and left, extending forwards to the temporal lobe and backwards up to the parietal lobe. These are well-known auditory processing pathways, and it's surprising to see them so well defined on the right. These could be out of a physiological textbook, the specificity with which it picks out these auditory processing pathways, but that's brain reading. Doing the stats on this is again something I'm not an expert in. Sophie Scott is an expert in this. When you, if you look and you do very careful correction, excluding hopefully all statistical artifacts, and you look what is special about the live condition compared to the speaking with a recording condition, for example, because they were markedly different. You could tell in the brain whether they were speaking with the recording or speaking with the live person, even though the subject didn't know. What we find is one small area here in the temporal lobe, which is well known from the cognitive neuroscience of speech, in that this area is maximally active, is activated when you speak using your voice, and is not active when you listen to someone else's voice. Now, when I speak, or when I listen to you, in both cases I'm listening, but I hear my own voice differently from the way I hear everyone else's voice. You're familiar with the discomfort engendered by listening to your voice on a tape recorder, because that's not the way you normally hear your own voice. You hear your voice through bone conductance primarily. So your voice is signaled as different. And what the analysis here showed was that in the case of speaking in live reciprocal coupling with a person, but not in the case of speaking with the recording or any of the other speaking conditions, this area, which is normally inhibited when you speak, was disinhibited, which means that your voice has been treated as if it was everyone else's voice. That's the take home. Your voice here has the signature of just any old voice. So that thing that marks it normally as distinct, as a marker of the distinction between self and other, is no longer clear. It's brain reading. I want to be cautious about it, but remember, this matches the phenomenology quite well. Remember what we saw in the speech production with those errors. We saw that something which is normally considered to be me and you became something that we do together. When we're speaking together, we're vulnerable. If you make a mistake, you can trip me up, and vice versa. Here we're seeing a sort of an eradication of the distinction between these normally well-defined roles of I speak or you speak into a we speak. Remember that repetition that we found everywhere is bringing into being of an identity of a subjective. Remember that the concerns in each case were collective concerns. They had to do with establishing a collective subject of some sort, collective demands, collective beliefs, collective sentiment, collective identity. But that can only be done by actually coming together and doing this together in real time, in action. So what we're seeing here is a kind of a marrying of these diverse observations. The neuroscience is only one of them, the behavioral observations are one. The significance of this for the various people who are doing it, why a football fan would choose to chant, why a monk would choose to chant, why a protester would choose to chant. They're telling sort of the same story, which is that we need to take this kind of notion of a collective subject seriously. And there's perhaps why this is so difficult to treat of scientifically, because we're not very good at collective subjects. It's in analysing the relationship between speech and music that this really, for me, can be laid out most clearly. I've set up a notional, you don't have to buy into this, it's a notional continuum here, extending from silent speech, which is definitely me on my own, Descartes and his thing saying, je suis, j'existe. And then there's a monologue like this where I'm talking and you're listening, and occasionally you raise questions, but basically it's unidirectional. And then afterwards we have a conversation and it's much more negotiated and equitable. And then we got joint speech where suddenly we're all doing things at the same time. And then as the musical elements come in, we get the origin of a beat, a tactus. We get some rhythmic regularity, which allows further synchronization, which makes it simpler. And as you add more musical elements like polyphony or instruments, so the role of this beat becomes very important. There was no beat down there. There's no way to join in with my silent speech. You just can't do it. You can join in my joint speech if we both know the text and we're both willing to say the text. But when we get into the musical domain, you can join in. You can even join in if you don't really know the words. You're singing along with summer hits in some language you don't know. So it seems to me that there's a kind of a spectrum of subjectivities here. I said the word mind is going to be difficult because mind suggests there's only one level of subjectivity. But here you can see I've graphically laid out the different kinds of subjectivity, and joint speech represents this confluence of speech and music in which we're collectively doing something, but it's scaffolded by our shared knowledge and shared intentions. And as we then introduce further musical elements, joining in becomes easier, but the sense of commitment becomes washed out. You're not committed to something if you dance along with a tune. If you're dancing along at a wedding and the song is Voulez-vous coucher avec moi and you're mouthing the words on the dance floor, you're not going home with anyone. That's not what it's all about. You can have kids dancing to reggae music spouting Rastafarian nonsense. They don't really want Haile Selassie to come back as the reincarnation of God and take over Ethiopia. That's not what it's about. You're not committed in the same way by mouthing words on the dance floor. So I'm going to just kind of wrap up a little bit by pointing to how to deal with this. The questions that are raised here. We've got an interesting behaviour. You can do science. There's no science, and I think the reason that it's difficult is because we don't have a good vocabulary here for talking about collective subjects that are transients, that don't have skin boundaries, that aren't single brains. I want to come back then to the importance I put on the voice at the start and what it is to speak. My hypothesis here is that speaking is a very, very special act which brings into being a kind of an intentional domain, a subjectivity. This goes back to an older view of the subject that predates the Cartesian and Kantian subject. You go back to Aristotle, the subject is anything that can bear an intentional predicate, anything that can be said to desire or to want, for example, or to intend. And that seems to apply just perfectly well to the crowd. And so we get away from the problems of the subject as given to us by the combination of Hume and Kant and Descartes, then we can maybe do this. On this view, though, a subject is not a permanent fixed entity. So Aristotle said that voices and souls go together. In De Anima, he pretty much said if it speaks, it's alive, it's got a soul, a nous. Not a psyche, a nous. Voices, and he then went on to say we use the word voice metaphorically when we speak of a lyre having a sweet voice and so on. But he said that's only derivative. Its core meaning is something that emanates from a living being. Stephen Connor in Cambridge has done a wonderful survey of the history of voices coming from unexpected places. It's called Dumbstruck, and it was published in 2000. And he points out that the voice, historically, when voices come from unexpected places, something really fishy is going on. Ventriloquism is creepy as all hell, of course. Voices coming from stomachs, it's probably a case of demonic possession. Voices coming from the ground, you've got the Delphic Oracle. The voices coming from odd places are given a kind of authority, are treated with a seriousness that is kind of lost to us now. And we have very many attributes that identify us. You can be identified from the way that you walk, from your colour of your iris, your fingerprints, and your voice. But the voice is interestingly different from all the other markers. And I think he puts it very nicely. He says giving voice is the process which simultaneously produces articulate sound and produces myself as a self-producing being. I didn't pay him to say this. He said this before our paths ever crossed. So I find this perspective really, really helpful. It helps to provide a kind of a rational explanation for why we find this repetition again and again and again, because this subjectivity, this collective subject, can only be brought into being through the participation, through the act of speaking together, which of course centers us and gives us a commonality, which is transient, but which fixes us at a particular location, a point in time, a point in space. Now you come back to why this is such a central part of so many rituals, of masses, of order-founding rituals in every culture. And if you attend to the way that speaking together gives us a sense of presence, of commonality, helps us, as it were, to adopt a common perspective on the world, this starts to make a lot of sense. And I just want to leave you with two examples that do this, I think. One is not from any of the domains we've talked about. Joint speech arises sometimes elsewhere. Street performers know it very, very well. So these are the Sharp brothers. They're doing something you've seen before. How often have you seen that line done? Do you want to see a show? Yes. When everyone says yes, they're committed. Now you've made a collective out of the crowd. Now they're not going to walk away. They've said yes, they're committed. Now they're in one place. It's technology. Primary school teachers know this. They get the crowd, they get the wildly inattentive and varying individuals in the classroom together through joint speaking. You find an awful lot of joint speaking in the junior classes in primary school. And finally, my final example, which is going to be topical again, comes from outside Trinity College on the 31st of December. Happens every New Year's Eve. This happens. It happened to me at that particular occasion. I wasn't outside Trinity. I was in a room. My son was having a party. There was tons of people in the room. There was probably 30, 40 people having disparate conversations, all engaged in disparate acts. And then coming up to midnight, they just stopped. And they all came together and they all counted down. And I just stood there transfixed. I couldn't believe what I was seeing because I'm studying this bloody thing and I wasn't expecting it. And I should have been expecting it because its role is quite clear in this instance, is to bring people into the same space and in this case particularly at the same time. That's why I think this is really, really important. You can view time as simply one damn thing after another. And we know lots of the mysteries of this world, the mysteries of consciousness, the mysteries of sentience, force us to recognize that time has another characteristic, which is that it's lived experience, that it's rooted in the now. And we can see how a common perspective arises through the act of joint speaking by recognizing its role in fixing this now for diverse people at diverse places at diverse times. Okay, I'll shut up there. That's more or less what I came to say.
We have time for questions.
Yeah, Nuala.
How important is repetition, do you think, to the whole business of synchronization?
Completely important.
Very important.
Because the collective identity, the Manchester United Football Club fan identity, only really exists while we're doing it. Yeah, and the repetition is quite extreme. I mean, I've spent, you go to spend 24 hours with the monks in Glentown Abbey, you're chanting for 5 hours. You go spend it with the Hare Krishnas, you're chanting for about 8 hours of the day there. It's a very, 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 it takes up a lot of time. Of course, these are extreme examples. These are monastic orders. Most of us are not monastic orders, but even people who just do this on a regular basis once a week, that regularity is quite telling, and it happens in every tradition. Yeah.
Thanks, that was really interesting, very thought-provoking. I'm curious about what you were talking about earlier on about people who are synchronizing when they're saying novel statements. So
In the lab.
husband and wife and
Yeah.
so forth. Yeah. And I was thinking about that and the fMRI study that you did then, and I was wondering what do you think is the role of visual cues? So if
We've done that. I can tell you exactly what the role of visual cues is. It's worth about 10 milliseconds at the start of a phrase. So in speech, we basically, speech is chunked into phrases and you've got pauses in between. And the most variable element in speech is always a pause. They're not intrinsically timed. They don't have any set duration. And when you can see each other, even if we're reading off the script, I can get enough from peripheral vision, the inspiration after a pause. I can get a little bit of a cue so that it's very easy to test. You just turn the chairs around and get people to do the same thing. We can measure the asynchrony, and it makes about a 10 millisecond difference at the start of a phrase. By the time you're 1 or 2 syllables in, that difference is gone. So that's the only difference. The eyes in joint speech play a very different role from the eyes in every other kind of speech. As far as I can see, I like to think now of the eyes and the voice always working together. When we're speaking like this, the eyes are extremely important. In a conversation, the eyes are very much part of the conversation. They hold it in place, they establish roles of speaker and listener, they structure the turn taking and so on. And yet in the choir, everyone's just looking ahead. So that normal, the eyes are a means of negotiating, I suppose.
In a choir, there's a conductor who is leading the tempo.
True, but as long as I can hear you, I don't have to negotiate with you in a choir. In a conversation, I have to negotiate. Right now, we're negotiating. Right? So.
I don't have a fully formed question, but maybe if you know any more about it, you could say, it was really interesting. I'm interested in the idea that if we speak together, it can bring us together in a moment. But then self is that story that we tell and that we carry with us. And maybe that links in with Nuala's idea and yours about the repetition, that it kind of helps us remember that story, so the moments of identity are construed kind of into a longer sense of identity. And then earlier I was going to ask you about why you made the distinction between rugby singing, and then you went on to explain that later. I was just wondering if maybe the musical side of things, or the fact that the repetition with the music kind of like I'm just kind of thinking this idea of an earworm, or how your identity can be kind of, you can have memories of that kind of automatic rhythm without having a commitment to the meaning immediately, and then over time it might get integrated more. I don't know, like this viral sense of identity.
Well, there are two kind of questions. The first one about establishing more more permanent markers of our commonality, I suppose, through the repetition and rituals. Absolutely, I think the reason that these get integrated and stylized into rituals is because after the ritual is over, you go forth, you're bound by what just happened. The ritual is part of the constitution of you as a, in some cases as a Christian or as a Buddhist or as a Hindu. Well, I don't even like to think in terms of those classic names for religions. All societies take part in rituals, and the rituals form this reference point, I suppose, as it were. And I've been taking this work of late to people who study the aesthetics of religion and so religious studies scholars. They just look at the smells and bells and forms. And there's a great deal of awareness of the importance of synchronization in ritual, but it has never made its way into the scientific discourse. It's always been an observation of people ritual studies is not the first place you think of ritual studies in scanner. How are we going to do that? You can't stick the Archbishop in with his mitre into the scanner, it's not going to work. But maybe by taking this sort of pluralistic view of things we can begin to make the link. That is, the rituals, they're not merely cultural. They do serve to orient us with respect to everything. The second question, with respect to sports, I'm a bit at a loss here. Why do some traditions have chanting and others don't? A friend sent me recently a very rare outbreak of chanting at a tennis match in Australia, and it looks so out of place. I don't know. I mean, the singing tradition in rugby, you see, has its own peculiar history. They're usually rude songs, for example, and the carry-on of, I used to be a busker on Grafton Street, I'll tell you, the carry-on of rugby supporters is completely different from the carry-on of soccer supporters.
Yeah, but I was surprised that you distinguished between those. It felt like they were serving exactly the same purpose. I know you might have said that with the...
When you go to the match, you don't sing the songs during the match, you sing the songs before and after the match.
Yeah.
And you don't get the repetition.
I was thinking of Old Lang Syne at New Year's serving the same kind of role as the countdown, or like the referees of so-and-so, or... Sure,
there's going to be overlap because the object of study here sort of erases the border between speech and music. It means it leaks out into all these, into all these, and songs definitely play a role here. And I'm choosing to focus my inquiry on joint speech and to look away from the more musical elements. But the questions are continuous. Yeah.
The spectrum you showed, I kind of helped clarify that, I think, rather than separate.
Yeah.
Probably more of a comment than a question, Fred, but visual research is often criticised for being very restricted in how it sort of studies its subjects. And I suppose it's comforting to see that auditory people are similarly criticised. I come across some stuff on dyslexia recently, where phonology models are really, really dominant. And I was really interested to see that kids with dyslexia, they don't just make their errors within the domain of reading, but they can often be very, very poor at mathematics, like just saying their tables, which is really a rhythmic thing, and also just naming objects, which has nothing to do with reading. So perhaps what I'm missing, by sticking within these domains of study, we sort of miss the bigger picture in some ways. And I think you were kind of getting at that maybe at the start.
Yeah, and dyslexia is an interesting one. Highly contentious. The question of what the domain of dyslexia is, whether it's a reading disorder or a sequencing disorder or a general cognitive disorder, is really interesting, but I don't think you can even begin to make progress with those questions unless you recognize the fundamental changes made to human cognition by the skill of reading and writing. Literacy changes cognitively. It introduces all kinds of changes into the way memory works, the way that we interact with each other. The structure, the fabric of life, our being is changed hugely by literacy. And that has favoured some people are naturally good readers, some people are naturally poor readers. If we were to come along tomorrow and attribute huge cultural significance to your skill at playing the oboe, at the moment, some of us are good oboe players and some of us are pretty poor oboe players. If we valorised and gave lots of money and success to people who are good at playing the oboe, and we called people who didn't play the oboe well diseased or disordered or disabled, we'd obviously have ethical problems with that, but that's precisely what we've done with reading. That is, reading came along, and for independent reasons, it becomes really important in our lives, and it becomes so important that now we recognise as a shortcoming if we just happen to be built like a poor oboe player, I suppose. So literacy is hugely overlooked in all this and what it did to us. Tina, and then...
I was actually thinking about that because I was reminded of in shared reading and guided reading where the voices go along together. One of the functions of that is to try to move the child towards much more automatised decoding, where going more smoothly, more fluently. So the adult voice is there to sort of pull them along not just to scaffold underneath when they pause, but it's also to help expedite and smooth.
When you speak of that pulling, I know exactly what you mean, yeah. And so the connection is very real.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a small literature in the stuttering world of stabilising stuttering by having people speak chorally with a recording though, which loses some of that. The ability to pull is much stronger with a real person.
So what happens if you were presenting your synchronous, your good husband and wife team who were so on the button? What if you gave them text that wasn't punctuated and watched them negotiate pausing? Because I bet they'd end up pretty good, but they'd have to start, if you gave them blank text. I mean, one of the things that drives me crazy at the moment is my Kindle can read aloud, but it doesn't pause at full stops. This sort of thing. It's not like Audible book stuff, those kinds of things.
Pauses are one of the hardest things. It's funny, saying nothing is one of the hardest things. You could do that. So there's all kinds of ways you could use this as an instrument to study. That would be studying the processes of reading and parsing the text and overlaying the pauses on it. That would be an interesting way to take that.
But to watch how they negotiate an unpunctuated text could be really interesting.
It could be interesting. I have no idea how they would do it, and there you'd have to sensitively attend to the design of the text and to introduce ambiguities. If it's too clear, it's not going to be. Some texts are really easy to read without punctuation. Sometimes they're very dependent on it.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. There's an interesting point which I made last week, Bren, but not today, which is that there's a form of joint speech which has no individual counterpart, and that's joint silence. When we partake in a minute's silence, remembrance for the victims of the Parisian tragedy, we take part in something together. We have a very strong sense of co-presence, of being rooted at the same place at the same time. If you're quiet on your own, I'm afraid you've just been quiet. Nothing is achieved whatsoever. Yeah.
I was wondering, have you, or has anyone looked at all on the extent to which that joint speech has an impact on an individual's sense of belonging to that community? Because I'm quite interested in kind of in-group, out-group stuff, and certainly with kids, you can create what they call a minimal group by simply putting the kids in different coloured t-shirts. Even without an explanation, the kids will create perceptions of different groups. I'm just wondering whether, in some way, this is having a similar effect, whether by getting people to engage in something, in a joint speech with what were initially strangers, increases their beliefs of having something in common with them.
Two things to say to that. Yes, we have initial evidence. So there's a social psychologist in London, Daniel Richardson, who has been using this. He's been having people perform collective tasks. He's got a nice setup where you can run 500 people at one time. Everyone has a clicker, and we're all working on making something happen on the screen together. And he's done run conditions where people chant something together beforehand, and he finds that doing that as opposed to any other form of non-synchronized collective activity increases the sense of belonging to a group, increases the group performance, accuracy, and feeling of well-being after it. The other thing I'd say to that is, I'm kind of collecting examples. Here's an example of, this is taken from the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, which is, of course, a site of contention. And if you just have a look at what's going to happen is there's a bunch of dispersed Palestinian protesters and there's a bunch of Israeli riot police. And the riot police are already a discriminable entity. They all wear the same thing, they're all pointed the same direction, they can all be assumed to have common purpose. But look what happens when the Palestinians start chanting. Oops. Is this going to work for me? Now you've got two. When they say when the Allahu Akbar comes together, synchronized, which it rarely is. Allahu Akbar is not often spoken in a synchronous fashion, the takbir as it's called. But when it does, it works to congeal them into a group. So now you've got an opposition of two equally sized groups.
Because sorry, I won't take up more time, but just I also noticed your comment, and I think it's really accurate. View is that it's used a lot in the early years of primary school, so group formation, and similarly the street entertainers. It does seem that it may have this important role in bringing people together, and as human beings we probably have that tendency to look for the group to become a part of.
Yeah.
If you look at the Our Father, get a mixed group of Christians reciting the Our Father, and they're all together until lead us not into temptation, whatever's the last line, deliver us from evil, amen. The Catholics stop, and the Protestants go on. And it's really clear, there's two more lines for the Protestants, they have a different version.
And we've noticed that so often it gets a giggle every time it happens.
Yeah, exactly.
Here's another one. I always ask, does anybody speak Lao? Nobody ever speaks Lao in my talks, I don't know, in Lao. And then I ask them, what are these kids doing? And they always get it. Thanks, Amy. They're doing the times table, so you don't have to speak the language really.
But she's a native Lao speaker.
Born and raised.
We'll have one more question then.
Yes, my question is maybe a little bit off, but I was wondering if you're talking about speech, if we about precondition of speech, if you look at other species, whether you see that there is a sensitivity about, I'm going before speech is sound, or sensitivity about sound and voice, and look at other species, starting from birds to others. I was wondering if there's any study there, and we can connect it to your study, or it goes back to kind of precondition of joint speech, probably. Why we do have just a little bit of continuation to humans.
Synchronization phenomena are ubiquitous in nature. You find them in lots and lots and lots and lots of species. There's been a great deal of attention paid to human synchronization because we are flexible with respect to tempo. Nearly all examples of synchronization in the animal kingdom, you have an invariance with respect to tempo. That is, individuals, fireflies or starlings or whatever, they synchronize at a fixed tempo that's given by their biological properties, the speed of chemical processes or the morphology of the wings or something like that. It's only really in humans that you get this flexibility, so that we're happy tapping along within quite a range of tempi and joining in behaviors at a slow or fast rate. I'm not clear that we can be as categorical as we have been in that nature. There are now quite a few examples of animals, including a famous cockatoo, Snowball the cockatoo, you may have seen on YouTube dancing along to the Beastie Boys. There's been a sea lion trained in this regard. So it seems that we're not as usual. You know, when we think we're special, if we go look harder, we're not quite as special as we would think. But certainly this flexible coupling seems to be uniquely human, or a highly developed characteristic of human collective activity. Of course, because the language in that sense isn't found in the animal kingdom, we don't have a direct parallel.
I wanted to take that to, I was wondering if the issue of sound and rhythm would be kind of an infrastructure of what probably could be what is developed in humans as well. For example, even in you see people gather and do some drumming, jam drumming, without knowing each other, without having the same. So they immediately can pick up.
But they've got a tactus.
Or even in more advanced cases, like in the theater, the practices in theater, they do some synchronization and then they talk in the same way without being prepared. I was wondering if
theater folk know a lot about this. The drummers are less impressive because once there's a tactus, we can all join in. You can be a good drummer or a bad drummer. Once there's a beat, you know where to join in. In theatre, there's a practice that's often done in workshops as a form of getting people attuned to each other. It's a thing called mirroring, where we will jointly imitate each other's behaviour, but in a non-periodic manner. So we have to really attend to each other, have to be very co-present to each other. It's a great way to warm people up. So there's a lot of insight, I suppose, from certain kinds of human practice that can be brought to bear on this. Some very interesting experiments done recently based on the theatre form, the theatrical form of synchronization. There's been some empirical studies done which are very, very telling. Synchronization is better if there's no leader and no follower. If we are more or less democratic or equitable in our portion of roles.
Okay, thank you very much for your talk today. If anyone has any further follow-up questions, you can liaise with Fred afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you.